By late 1995, the momentum Sega had gained with the Genesis was starting to wane, and this was not boding well for the company as a whole. The international sales of the Genesis had been Sega's first and only real bona fide success outside of arcades, and the American and Japanese branches of the company had very different priorities at this point in time. In Japan, where the Genesis, or Mega Drive if you prefer, had never really taken off to begin with, they were focusing all their resources and marketing into the Saturn, which was already showing a lot of promise in its first year of sales. But in America, where the Saturn and 32X were both already underperforming, they wanted to milk the Genesis for all it was worth, and keep that gravy train moving as long as possible. When Nintendo released Donkey Kong Country in 1994, it was a runaway success, with the heavy marketing focus on its state-of-the-art pre-rendered graphics as the major contributing factor to its high sales. In response to this, Sega decided to push their own pre-rendered game to compete, with developer BlueSky Software being chosen to develop. BlueSky, no relation to the animation studio of the same name, was founded in 1988 and developed a handful of games for PC and Atari consoles, as well as Sega. In 1991, after the release of Starflight and Joe Montana Football, BlueSky would sign a contract with Sega to become a second-party developer and create games exclusively for Sega consoles, which would later include the Jurassic Park tie-in game for the Genesis in 1993, as well as a sequel game the following year. When Sega began looking for a team that could create a game visually on par with Donkey Kong Country, BlueSky would be the studio ultimately decided upon after Sega was shown a tech demo by programmer Carl Robillard, inspired by vector ball demos for the Amiga. The team was told to make a game consisting entirely of pre-rendered assets, just like Donkey Kong Country. To help prevent the sometimes choppy-looking frames of Nintendo's game, BlueSky would create a graphics engine called Vector Piece Animation, which would be able to seamlessly blend animation frames together to result in smoother-looking movement, as well as enable the game to run at a consistent 60 FPS. With this engine, and the game's origin stemming from vector graphics, it only made sense for BlueSky's new game to pay homage, soon being titled VectorMan. VectorMan is a side-scrolling 2D platformer shooter taking place in the year 2049, by which point Earth has been completely wrecked by pollution. Humankind has since fled into space, sending mechanized Orbots to clean up the toxic waste left behind. But when a particular Orbot named Raster, because a raster is the opposite of a vector, get it, accidentally has a nuclear missile integrated into his body, he goes haywire, becoming the ruthless warmonger Warhead, and inciting an Orbot uprising, threatening to kill any humans who dare return to Earth. The only opposition turns out to be a humble sludge barge pilot, an Orbot named VectorMan. Having been off-planet during Warhead's planet-wide revolt, he remains unaffected and rises to the occasion to defeat Warhead and bring the planet back to peace. VectorMan consists of 16 total levels, or days, the majority of which being side-scrolling stages akin to the likes you'd see in Contra or Mega Man. VectorMan can run, jump, and crouch, as well as shoot laser pulses in 8 directions. He can use a boost jump in the air to extend his jump height and to damage enemies below him. Each level places a time limit on the player to reach the end or else they lose a life, with occasional time extensions placed in set spots, although these are usually only found in the particularly large levels. Despite the time limits, the game does place a large focus on item collection. You collect photons to increase your score and gain extra lives, and breakable monitors carry various items or power-ups. The end of each level will grant bonus points based on how many items you picked up and how many monitors you destroyed. You also get a bonus if you manage to clear a level without firing a single shot, but God knows I never tried to pull that off. A few levels consist solely of dedicated boss battles, usually either on rails or taking place on a single screen, where a transformed VectorMan has to defeat the enemy to move on. Power-ups can include multipliers that increase the value of photons, lives, and points you gain accordingly for a limited time, as well as those that temporarily modify VectorMan's current weapon to increase its radius, power, angle or rate of fire, or add the ability to fire through solid surfaces. Apparently taking a page from Yoshi's Island, there are also several transformation items, here called morphs, such as a rocket, a car, grenade, or drill. These usually grant VectorMan invincibility, but perhaps more importantly, they allow him to access hidden areas. VectorMan also has a health gauge that can be replenished by picking up health-restoring orbs that are either found inside monitors or dropped by enemies. And these will also be affected by any multipliers the player currently has active. So, for example, if the player has a ×3 multiplier, each orb will restore 3 points of health. VectorMan begins the game with 4 points on his health meter, but special max health orbs can be found in specific levels that each permanently add another point to his total, up to a maximum of 10. In some select levels, you can also gain access to a bonus round by hunting down and destroying a shield generator and a satellite dish in that order. The bonus round consists of a simple but challenging shooting game, where winning grants the player 25,000 points and losing grants them only 5,000. One of the first things that stuck out to me about VectorMan's gameplay is that it encourages perfect runs through each level without expecting them. Each level's ticking timer keeps the player moving, but the score bonuses gained for collecting every item or destroying every TV are also just tempting enough to players wanting to test themselves. Because of the limited placement of time extensions, there's often very little room for player error if they do plan to attempt a flawless run of any given level. This stays true to the core spirit of score-based platformers, where constantly failing and having to play over and over is actually slowly teaching you how to play better, learning the level layout and enemy placements enough to be able to eventually do a near-flawless run. In fact, I don't think any platformer I've played has ever embodied that experience for me more than VectorMan did. VectorMan's opening level is massive, with multiple branching paths and offshoots that are there solely for the player to rack up more points. And I spent what must have been around 2 hours just constantly replaying this first level over and over. I died dozens of different ways in a dozen different spots, each time trying to scope out just a little bit more of the level, to explore just one more area that I hadn't seen yet. And yeah, that type of experience is always going to be a little frustrating on the surface, but after enough time and retries, after it all finally clicked, I was able to map out an ideal route where I could collect all the essential power-ups and multipliers while leaving myself enough time to defeat the boss at the end, and defeat it without getting hit no less. That right there is the real appeal of action platformers. The feeling of empowerment you get when you grow from a dumb, stupid baby fumbling with the controls to a confident expert flawlessly traversing a series of enemies and blind jumps with near-perfect precision. By the end of the game, I even pulled off an all-photon and all-monitor bonus on at least one level. When I finally moved on from the first level and made my way through the rest of the game, though, I couldn't help but start to notice that no other level of the game is really designed like that. Once you're past that first stage, almost every other one is basically a straight shot, with only brief offshoots or dead ends to explore. Very few of these branches actually serve as any sort of shortcut or alternate path the way they do in that opening level. The next level that seemed to be anywhere near as sprawling or intricate was day 13. It's easy to see that maybe the dev team didn't have the time to make every level super open and exploration heavy, and I can understand them wanting to put their best foot forward for that. But the feeling of slowly getting better at each level as I played them over and over unfortunately never really extended past the game's opening. Still, VectorMan is almost constantly teaching the player to pick their priorities carefully. Unlike a lot of other shooter platformers, your health isn't replenished between levels, and so bum rushing your way through boss fights is somewhat discouraged. Sure, you might manage to defeat a boss with 1 hit point left, but that won't save you when you get killed by the first enemy you run into in the next level. I mean, if you've got the lives to spare, that's not terrible, but it is one small way that the game pushes you to study enemies' attack patterns and avoid taking hits in the first place. Day 8 also offers the player a choice in that there's both a max health up and a bonus round located in the level, but it's impossible to get both, as the max health is located after a point of no return that makes returning to destroy the satellite dish impossible, requiring you to decide which is more important. And this is an especially vital decision if you're playing on the hardest difficulty, where you have lower health to begin with and need to find every last health upgrade in order to reach the maximum. There were only a few things about this game that genuinely frustrated me. For one thing, these stupid bee enemies are littered all throughout the game, and they suck because they always swarm in groups of 4, but will reappear an infinite number of times if you go off screen even a little bit. Which is notable because they're the only enemies in the game that respawn, and they're fucking everywhere. Secondly was this specific enemy in Day 5. These shield enemies can only be attacked from behind, and this one blocks the path you need to reach the end of the level. The only way to get past him is to lure him into jumping, which he only does if you're dangerously close to his hitbox, and it can be really tricky to find the right timing you need to slip underneath him before he lands on you. This was probably the only time in the game where I needed to look up the solution online, because even when I figured out the thing I was supposed to do, it felt like I was doing something wrong anyway. The final battle against Warhead was cool, though. I was having trouble landing enough hits on him for the first couple of tries, until I tried to jump over him to grab a health orb, and consequently stumbled upon the fact that VectorMan's boost jump will do crazy damage to him. It's a great example of risk-reward, as just getting that close to Warhead in the first place is likely to result in taking a hit. But you only need to land 4 or 5 boost jumps on him to win. It was just a cool thing to figure out on my own after struggling to defeat him in a straight-up gunfight for so long. VectorMan visually is pretty darn stunning. The pre-rendered graphics here I feel have held up far better over time than those in Donkey Kong Country, and I think that's simply due to the fact that VectorMan was designed to look much more abstract across the board. Donkey Kong Country, while clearly cartoonish, was still trying to emulate actual environments and animals, with a lot of complicated shapes, texturing, and lighting. Meanwhile, VectorMan chose to stick to simpler shapes. A lot of the moving objects and enemies are groups of abstract pieces stuck together to form larger bodies. While Donkey Kong Country tried to appear as cutting-edge and revolutionary as possible, VectorMan seemed to prioritize just being visually appealing in general. That's not to say VectorMan is necessarily any less technically impressive than Donkey Kong Country per se. VectorMan himself is actually not a singular character sprite, but instead 23 individually crafted objects programmed to move in unison at all times. But even still, the developers weren't willing to let the pursuit of snazzy graphics intrude on the actual gameplay. Originally, every moving character or enemy in the game was planned to be made entirely of spheres, so that they would be able to experiment with all sorts of angles, perspective, and scaling. But this was dropped because it would have made the game's visuals too abstract, and in an action game you really want your graphics to be as readable as possible. The team also decided to scale back on long, intricate character animations for the sake of keeping the controls tight, snappy, and responsive. Moreover, an entire level was cut from the final game where VectorMan would ride a rocket and try to maneuver it between moving columns. Despite being visually impressive and mechanically creative, the dev team decided that it simply wasn't fun. And I think that shows that despite the game being made for essentially a dick measuring contest with Nintendo, the team still had their priorities in order. The game overall is also just oozing with 90s era tood. The game is just so unapologetically 1995, it's so charming to look back on this. Sega's mascot, Sonic, has sometimes been accused of being too 90s for the modern day, and frankly, that's an opinion I've never been able to agree with. Sonic was made to have a timeless quality to him, the same way Mickey Mouse does. If you want to see real 90s style, you play VectorMan. The game's entire aesthetic is dirty and grungy. The easy difficulty mode is called lame. Its very premise is built on 90s sensibilities like the threat of pollution. The game's instruction manual is steeped in sarcasm and repeatedly insults the player simply because that's what was cool back then. Even the idea of naming the game after vector graphics is such a product of its time, since vector graphics are so commonplace in the modern day that we don't even notice them anymore. Seriously, all we need is the Dare lion to come waltzing through while a Spice Girls song plays, and the game could be treated as a bona fide time capsule. This sort of gamers or lamers attitude the game exhibits even extends to its cheat codes. If you use a single cheat on your way to defeating Warhead, even just a level select, the normal ending sequence will be replaced with a message telling you to beat the game for real. Honestly, I miss when games used to do stuff like this, back when seeing a game's ending was a reward in and of itself. Nowadays you can just look it up on YouTube, which is lame. Ah crap, now I'm being all 90s about it. Development of VectorMan went very smoothly due to the team's familiarity with Sega hardware. And while Sega themselves had very little involvement in the game's creation, they did do a pretty significant marketing push. $12 million was spent on the game's advertising, and the game's North American release even shipped with this, Willy Wonka's golden ticket deal, where random cartridges would include a phone number and address on screen when you beat the game. Lucky owners of said carts could then return them to the listed address to receive prizes, ranging from a free Sega Saturn to a grand prize of $25,000. The game would be among the best-selling video games of the 1995 holiday season, selling 500,000 copies before the end of the year, although this was still far short of its main competition, Donkey Kong Country 2, which sold 900,000. Critically, VectorMan was almost unanimously praised, acclaimed for its level design and great techno soundtrack, often described as slower and moodier than other music for the platforming genre. Of course, the game's graphics were highly praised as well, with some critics even saying they seemed on par with some early PlayStation games released around the same time. The game's relationship to Donkey Kong Country was not lost on critics either, as both games were seen as successful efforts to retain interest in their respective 16-bit consoles at a time when consumer interest was moving towards the next generation. VectorMan would go down as one of the most beloved games of the Genesis era, as well as receiving a sequel the following year. The game was released in Japan for the first time in 2000 as part of the SEGA Smash Pack for PC, and was even included in Sonic Gems Collection in 2005 as a bonus unlockable game. Unfortunately, over the years, VectorMan would join the increasingly long and depressing list of neglected SEGA franchises, but I think I'll talk about that when I discuss VectorMan 2 in the near future. Until then, play VectorMan. It's on Steam. Or you could buy a Genesis Mini, I guess. It's just a really fun and rewarding shooter platformer, and one of the best titles in the classic SEGA library.